I think it was around 1958 that I had that first recording session in this building behind me here. I don't know how I got this call, but I got a call from Jack Halloran, who was by far the biggest contractor in town. The first job I ever did with him was at Capitol, downstairs in Studio B, I think. It's a big room. But there were, I'm guessing, 16 singers, 8 gals, 8 guys. And in those days, you came to work with a dress shirt and a tie on. I got to the studio early, just wanted to get comfortable in the environment, and Jack was there, but no other singers. And so we talked for a little while, and I said, where do you want me to sit? And we had a setup of 2 microphones. I think they were Telefunkens, great big omnidirectional things. And the 8 gals were here, and the 8 guys were here, and he said, I want you to sit there. So that was my chair, and in a while, some of the singers started to come in, and they're moseying around and saying hello to a few people and meeting singers. And I sat down, and pretty soon a guy comes in and sits down next to me, and he says, Ravenscroft's the name. And I'm going, this is God. This is the God of all basses. Here's Tony the Tiger sitting right next to me. I knew his name. I knew him by reputation.
Good. They're great. These big crisp flakes of corn have a delicious toasted-in sugar frosting, just a jumping with energy.
And he had a great big hand. He's about 6'5", and a very bony type of a man, but a voice that just doesn't quit, way down on the bottom. A little while later, another guy comes in and sits on this side, and he introduces himself, and it's Bill Lee. And I'm going, oh my gosh, I'm part of the Trinity here, you know? This is God and his Son, and I'm sitting in the middle of them. And I won't forget how nervous I was. I remember as the first break came up after an hour and we had sung a song or two, I leaned over to Thurl and I said, I'll give you my left elbow for a couple of those notes on the bottom, because he can sing low. And Thurl looked me in the eye and he said, I'd give you that elbow right back because I can't read like you do. Wow. So it started in '58, and I just did a few casual things. I was going to college at the time, and then it picked up more around 1964. One night, Norm said, you know, when we get back to town, he said, I think you should meet Johnny Mann.
But I'd like to get to know you. Yes, I would. But I'd like to get to know you. If I could.
Well, I knew Johnny Mann's name. This was somebody who did a lot of contracting for groups and television programs. And I thought, wow, that'd be a good introduction. So anyway, got into town, called him. And I said, Johnny, my name's Fred Frank. Norman Luboff had asked me to touch base with you. He thinks I might be of value to your, as a contractor. Johnny Mann said, hi, Fred. Do you read music? I said, yes. Well, who wouldn't say yes? You know, I don't care if you can read or not. If you got that far, you're going to say, yes, I can read. Johnny Mann said, Fred, what's the key signature for B major? And because I had had incredibly solid teaching as a kid on the piano, I said 5 sharps, F, C, G, D, and A. He said, come on in. I came to his house, we visited for a while, I auditioned, and from then on, Johnny Mann called me frequently. Most of the stuff I did originally was just group backup stuff. Recordings, films.
Hey, hey, hey. Hey, hey, hey.
I remember one day, a fellow who I'd met in the studios, his name was Jay Meyer. And Jay came up and he was going to contract a job for a film called Finian's Rainbow. We met at Warner Brothers and went on to the sound stage. If you've never been on a sound stage, they are big. They'll hold a lot of musicians. And we were in there to do tracks for Finian's Rainbow. But when we took a break, Jay came over and he said, you stay here, I got a solo for you. Really? I think it was just a 2-line solo. There's a song in Finian's Rainbow called Necessity. Necessity. I'd done Finian's Rainbow on a stage play, so I knew the music already, but this one little solo said, oh, hell is the father of sin.
But no one knows the father of necessity.
And that day probably got me introduced to a lot of other people that I didn't know. And then things started happening, and then just started getting more and more calls. I started getting a lot of calls for the Christian musicians, those who contracted for them. And then that opened lots of other doors, and got involved with some Christian projects, and that turned me into, I was getting a lot of solo work now, and then they started having me do occasionally voiceovers for reading scripts, and I didn't have any experience doing that, but apparently it worked for them, and I got to do it, you know. And then a few commercials came my way, and did more and more films. In fact, I remember I did Out of Africa one day, couple hours. I got to the studio late because of rain. I got there 45 minutes late, and it was a pretty big crowd, and I got in there and sang, we recorded, and within an hour or so I was out of there. I did an album with Sinatra and his family, his son and his daughter. We did a Christmas album with them.
Here's some pipes.
3 golf clubs.
But I remember Sinatra came in, he came in with an entourage. There were a bunch of people in the booth there with him. And I remember his son was with him, but Nancy kind of stayed out where we were, the singers. And I remember visiting with Nancy, and she was very kind. She was very nice, and she, I think she had just hit with her song, Boots Are Made for Walking. And she was very down to earth. I had a pleasant conversation with her. Did some Petula Clark stuff, got to visit with her too, that was nice. Tennessee Ernie Ford, Ray Conniff, Henry Mancini. Henry Mancini was a wonderful man. I liked him as a person. Of course, he wrote wonderful stuff. We were up at Lake Tahoe doing a show. You stay out late when you're working the clubs. And I probably got to bed at 4 o'clock in the morning, and you don't have to get up until, you know, be there at the next show. Be there 7 o'clock, I guess, is call, and you go on at 8 or whatever. But I woke up with pain that morning. Couldn't understand the pain, and it wouldn't go away. And finally, when it was time to go to work, I was in a lot of pain, and I could barely drive. I could hardly hold still as I drove down. I got to the club, and I went backstage, and I saw Jenny, his wife, and I said, I'm having a lot of pain. I don't know what's going on, but I can't do this show tonight, which is not like me. So she took me to the hospital with my first kidney stone. And I didn't do the show that night.
She may be weary, women do get weary.
Jenny Mancini, a little sidebar here, used to sing in a group called the Meltones. So did my high school teacher, Sheldon Dizrit. And Sheldon had a mad crush on Jenny. They just were friends. They never really did any dating, but then she went on and married Henry Mancini.
Love still wears a smile. I know that we'll be two for the road.
I remember one time talking to Mancini, and I asked him what song did he enjoy the most. He said, Two for the Road. Wonderful song. He was just a very generous man. He didn't seem to be affected at all, reading his newspaper clippings or his rewards. He was just a really nice guy. He was available, he was approachable, and you never felt any sense of discomfort being around the guy. My life in Hollywood and where I was emotionally, there was a lot of conflict going on in my life, I would say. Struggling to feel a sense of identity with the skills that I have, and wanting to be accepted in the industry of studio singers. Ruth and I had divorced, and I had a son named Todd that I wasn't seeing much of. It was a tough time emotionally, but I was getting a certain amount of attaboys from the calls that I was getting, and the very competitive industry that I was being accepted in. So, you know, there were mixed emotions that were going on. We're going to go to the house in a little while where I lived when I was up here, and I have good memories of it. It was a quiet little place up in the hills, and had my dogs, and my landlord who lived downstairs was a real nice fella. This was coming home. This was a nice feeling, and it was just like I was totally escaping from what I thought was tension and chaos down there in the other part of town, and yet I was just, what, 2 miles away from it. This is the house right there. I moved up here from Stanton because I was commuting too much and taking too much time on the road, and I found this sweet little place.
You can see forever.
Well, here we are. In the background is Paramount Studios. Went in and out of that gate a few times. Worked on a few films here, and worked on the soundtrack for a television show with Carol Burnett and Lucille Ball. And we did On a Clear Day with Streisand here.
Up is where to grow.
My value was, I was an asset to them because there was a sound that I could make, and it was flexible. I have a pretty flexible voice, but I can read like crazy. And so I become a financial asset to them because I'll get it right now. I've worked for companies where they put lead sheets in front of you and you get paid by the song, so you go as quick as you can. Got a call one day, paint your wagon. Went over to the studio. This was really an unusual call because it was all men. And there were at least 100 singers there. And I only knew a couple of them. They weren't studio singers. They were the Roger Wagner Chorale, a professional classical choir. And so here I am in that group. First of all, Roger made sure that I was on this job. I was the only studio singer there. Wow. Anyway, one day we were doing a song from Paint Your Wagon, and Lee Marvin was in this movie. And I remember we would sit in the studio for long periods of time while we waited for Lee Marvin to learn his part. Lee Marvin is not a singer. And Lee Marvin did not have to act for that movie. If you've ever seen the movie, he was always drunk, and he was always drunk. And he had to sing this song, I was born under a wandering. And his tonality was just the worst. It became an editor's nightmare, but after many, 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 many hours, they finally put it together, and it sounds like he's singing. Anyway, we did the temp tracks. They went up and filmed and coordinated, and then they brought them back, and now they put in some other stuff. And we worked weeks on this job, totally. Maybe 4 or 5 weeks between the temp and the permanents. And I remember one day in the studio, we were singing to track. The orchestra part had already been done. And they showed all of us some footage, and they said, we want you to sound like this guy, and we want you to sound like this, you know, and if any of you feel as though you can sing in a Russian accent or a Chinese accent or whatever, we want you to sound like that guy looks. Oh, so I watched him for a while, a couple times, and I said, okay, let's go. And it was in the scene where Mr. Rumson, Lee Marvin, had just gotten married. And in this one scene, they're celebrating. And there was this one line that I sang, Mr. Rumson, and did it in a character voice to sound like that guy looks.
Mr. Rumson bought a bride out in California. He'd have saved a lot of money staying drunk and horny.
But I hear that, you know, there it is right there in the script. And then there's a couple other places where they had me do solos, and they put me on a separate track to bring added diction to a line where the chorus wasn't coming through clear enough. And so if you listen real close, then you can hear the Fred voice coming out a little bit.
CBS presents this program in color.
CBS, one of many places that I worked when I lived up here. I think of Danny Kaye and Red Skelton and Smothers Brothers and Carol Burnett and Art Linkletter and people like that. And I have fond memories of those encounters with them, mainly as a singer. And I'm glad I had that experience, I really do. And as I think about all the films and the television shows and the recordings, there's great memories, I'm glad, but they weren't really my niche. And I didn't realize it, but when I left LA, Hollywood, from a full-time position as being a singer, it occurred to me that I wasn't really fulfilling what was in here. I wasn't sure what it was, but I knew that this isn't what I wanted to do. I didn't feel a sense of purpose in it. I was making good income, but there was something missing, and it was purpose.